This is Intersection, a program of KBIA and the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Ryan Famuliner, and today we're dissecting the Missouri legislature's veto session that happened last week and talking about what it means going forward. Joining us in studio for the discussion today, Democratic Representative Chris Kelly represents Columbia and much of Boone County in the House. Republican Representative T.J. Berry is from Kearney. His district is northeast of Kansas City. He was the sponsor of House Bill 253, the tax cut bill that was the focus of a lot of debate this year. Marvin Overby is a political science professor at the University of Missouri. And joining us by Skype, Phill Brooks is the director of the Missouri Digital News and has been covering the state legislature since 1972. And for you in our audience, what do you think the results of last week's veto session mean for the state going forward? Share your thoughts. Give us a call at 573-882-8925 or email intersection@kbia.org. You could also tweet us at intersectkbia to join our online chat. Okay, well, we spent a lot of time on 253 and some of the repercussions of that. Another one we wanted to talk about a little bit today was House Bill 436. This was the one that was going to nullify some federal gun laws, or all federal gun laws. Why didn't that one go through? I know mainly it fell in the Senate, but maybe Chris Kelly, if you could help us a little bit on why that one didn't come through.
As the discussion on that went forward, it became increasingly clear that the bill was patently unconstitutional. And it wasn't just me saying this, it was people like the Cato Institute, conservative think tank. The principle of nullification is also opposed by Heritage Foundation. The NRA didn't take a position on the bill because they didn't want to look, again, foolish, because those portions of the bill that are unconstitutional are bad enough, but there are other portions of the bill which are constitutional, and those portions would have made it illegal for Missouri policemen to cooperate with federal law enforcement in enforcing any of these gun laws. So that was a huge problem.
Phil?
More than that, Representative Kelly, if that veto had been overridden in about 29 days, it would have been a misdemeanor offense for you guys to identify me because I happen to be a rifle owner. And this would have made it a crime to identify anybody who owned a firearm. It goes back to what I think was term limits of not very well-written pieces of legislation. That was not the General Assembly's intention, to make it a crime for any of us to report the name of Jay Nixon because he owns a rifle. It was to deal with something that happened in the New York area and the East Coast, identifying the addresses, names of people who owned, private persons who owned handguns. But it reflected what I'm seeing, an increasing pattern in the Missouri General Assembly of not crafting well-written, well-worked-out pieces of legislation.
I think in this case, it's largely because no one, I think, really thought this was going to be enacted or change policy. Unlike 253, which I think was a serious attempt to address a serious issue, this struck me as just symbolic legislation from the get-go. Right? This is something trying to rev up the base, trying to throw it out. I think, as Chris said earlier, patently unconstitutional. Even with a conservative judiciary at the federal level, they are a federalist judiciary, and they do not take kindly to challenges to federal supremacy. They would have struck most or large parts of this bill as soon as it was brought in. But this was never intended, I think, to actually change policy in the state.
Representative Berry, I see you nodding your head as
I
Marvin
absolutely
says
agree. It was not intended. It was to make a statement. Don't mess with the Second Amendment. Quit your trying to mess with it. We won't bring up these kind of bills. But if you really structurally want to have severe gun control, we're going to be fighting that, and we will do everything in our power not to allow it.
May not have been serious, but folks realized that a few hours before, by just 2 votes in the Senate, the override was defeated. The police chief of St. Louis City, Sam Dodson, said he was going to have to order his cops out there in the streets in St. Louis to stop working with the federal agents, with federal law enforcement agencies on gun crime issues and multiple felony suspects with firearm aspects in which the federal side could impose a harsher penalty. Who's going to have to order them to stop if this, quote, symbolic thing actually became law? That's something I would not have seen come this close out of a General Assembly 20-odd years ago, pre-term limits.
Well, and Representative Barrett, earlier you were talking about the practical versus the philosophical too. I mean, I guess what's the point in continuing the philosophical stuff if we're not going to get anywhere anyway? That's the idea.
The reason is at the federal level, several bills were brought up, and if a state says no, in the Constitution, the Second Amendment is held very highly, and we have our own state rights when it comes to the right to bear arms that we could push, maybe not in this framework, but there are other ways to do it, and we need to make sure that they know where we stand as Missourians. And that's not a Republican or Democrat issue. If you look at polling across the state, Kansas City, St. Louis, north, south, people fear their government to a certain extent and believe that gun ownership for their own protection, both at home and for other hunting reasons or protection reasons, is a right that needs to be guarded.
Representative Kelly?
Let's go back to the tax credit issue. People wonder, Chris, why don't you fix tax credits, or why don't you fix our infrastructure or our highways or something like that? And part of the reason is there's only so much energy and intellectual firepower in the General Assembly. And when we're busy with unconstitutional gun laws, with Sharia law, with Agenda 21, there's no time left to do the real work. And that's what we had in this last session. We had a festival of kind of intellectual self-congratulation, and nobody did the real work of the General Assembly. There's got to be a lot more, as TJ said before, there's got to be a lot more listening to each other on things like the tax bills and saying, this part just doesn't work. And that means reading the bills and listening to one another about the technical makeup of it.
But that's our committee system. Our committee system, to me,
Failed pretty comprehensively.
And if there's one thing that I would like to see reform in the legislature, it's not the floor, it's the committee system, because we're not doing a great job of really discussing bills, vetting bills, and stopping it there so that it doesn't come to the floor.
TJ, you're right about that. Chairmen have to start to say to sponsors, get this out of here and bring it back when it's in shape, even if they agree with it.
You know, and
Term limits undermine the
positive note
power
about
of chairs,
that, guys.
I think.
Phil, go
on a
ahead.
positive note on that, I think we've had some interim committees going on this summer into the fall that maybe dealing with that. The Joint Committee on Education is going to have a session to begin some discussions of dealing with what do we do with these thousands of kids in unaccredited inner city schools, an issue that this General Assembly has kind of not dealt with for the last few years. We've got some large joint committees / task forces to deal with the Medicaid expansion, Medicaid restructuring issue. I'm seeing a little bit more of an effort out of this General Assembly to actually lay down the groundwork of study and effort prior to coming into session in January to deal with these more complicated issues. It may be a good sign of what we're seeing out of Missouri's General Assembly this summer and fall.
Right. And Marvin, you were talking about term limits, I guess, is one of the points you were bringing up in this discussion as well.
Yeah, they're going to weaken committee chairs because you have committee chairs who are going to hold that position for months as opposed to years or decades before.
So that's going to affect the type of legislation we're seeing, the quality of legislation.
Their ability to craft quality legislation. I would add one other thing to what Chris said earlier about sort of the dangers of this sort of symbolic legislation. It not just eats up time and energy and intellectual capital in the chamber. It also risks revving up the public in ways that can be very counterproductive to long-term little r Republican government, right? And you see this on both the left and the right. You spend too much time dealing with these symbolic issues, sort of revving up your base, throwing red meat to the Democrats on some issues, to the Republicans on other issues, to liberals, to conservatives, and it makes that room in the center very, very small. So, I mean, I caution my friends on the left and my friends on the right to do less of that and spend more time working on real legislation.
And in a way, you're talking about really the credibility of the legislature,
exactly
too.
Right. Well, and the credibility of government more generally.
Right, right. Well, Well, one thing we didn't really talk about at all yet is what actually did happen at the veto session. We talked all about what did not get overridden. So maybe we'll take a few minutes here to chat about what did go through. Maybe we'll stick with you, Marvin, on this. What do you think will be the most notable to Missourians on what did actually come out, the vetoes that were overridden? We had 10 vetoes overridden, again, historical number, the most since 1833.
Right.
What are we going to see? Hasn't been a lot of coverage of that yet because everyone's been too busy talking about what we've been talking about. But what are we going to be talking about with this going forward? That's
an excellent question, and Representative Berry could speak more to this than I could. My guess is you're not going to hear a lot about any of these specific 10 bills. You're going to hear just a lot more about 10 bills. Mm-hmm. It's going to be probably portrayed as the governor being historically ineffective, historically overridden. If you start looking at the nuts and bolts of what's actually in these 10 bills, I think there's some problematic things that some Republicans may not want their names attached to, such as the Doe Run Company shield. It smacks a bit of favoritism out there, and so Republicans may not want to talk as much about these particulars of these 10 measures that were overridden, and probably focus more on that number 10. It's my guess.
Representative Berry, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's interesting. On the 10, several of them are, why is a bill originally written? What problem is it trying to address? House Bill 339 was an insurance bill that's basically stating that if you aren't carrying insurance and then you are in an accident and you are not able to claim as the same level of damages as someone that does have insurance. Why was that brought forward? Because of uninsured motorists. Okay. Is it the correct solution? I voted for it. But is it the only solution? No. House Bill 650, which is the Doe Run bill that you referred to earlier, I voted against that bill the first time, and I voted for it during veto session. And people could say, well, why'd you vote for it on veto session? Did something change? No. But then in veto session, it becomes much more of a political us versus them.
Sure.
And that goes back to, can you talk to one another? Because the most non-controversial bill, Senate Bill 170, which a Democratic senator had 5 words. Can you have video conferencing for voting for volunteer boards that aren't paid, your school board, your fire board, your water board. Okay. The senator called me on Monday night and said, TJ, I can't find a Democrat that's willing to handle this bill. Will you please handle it for me? So this last Wednesday, I was the only representative or senator that handled 2 bills. And the only way that happened was Senator Nadal and I became friends while attending a conference. It is a personal relationship that we must create in order to develop trust. And then so many of these other issues will fall by the wayside. You're right, Republicans will be saying we overrode 10 bills. But the tragedy of that is the governor had the opportunity to have input and chose not to.
Now, the criticism that the governor doesn't participate sufficiently in the legislation is very, very valid. Okay. The Doe Run bill is toast, I think, because of the Hammerschmidt. In Missouri, you're not allowed to pass legislation on more than one subject. This bill started out as changing the name of a state building, and now it gives a special court privilege to one company. That's hugely different. There's no way that's going to get by the court. TJ is absolutely correct about the personal relationships need to mean more in the working relationships. Because there's a bunch of us on both sides who are somewhat near the middle on lots of this stuff, and who could, if left to our own devices, we'd put together some pretty good things, and TJ's clearly part of that.
Well, I do need to take a moment to remind our listeners that this is Intersection, a program of KBIA and the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Ryan Famuliner, and today we're dissecting the Missouri legislators' veto session that happened last week and talking about what it means going forward. Joining us in studio for the discussion today, Democratic Representative Chris Kelly represents Columbia and much of Boone County in the House. Republican Representative T.J. Berry is from Kearney. His district is northeast of Kansas City. He was the sponsor of House Bill 253. Marvin Overby is a political science professor at the University of Missouri. And joining us by Skype, Phill Brooks is the director of Missouri Digital News and has been covering the state legislature since 1972. For you and our audience, what questions do you have for our panelists about what happened during the veto session this year? Go ahead and ask them by giving us a call at 573-882-8925 or email intersection@kbia.org. You could also tweet your question at intersectkbia. One thing that keeps coming up, again, you brought it up, TJ, you brought it up earlier, was the idea of the different branches of government not working together where you think that they should. Can you explain what's the problem? Is there a problem right now?
Concrete example.
Okay.
The veto that I overrode on House Bill 19 was the veto for the rebuilding of the vocational ed school in northeast Missouri. I begged the governor to work, literally begged, to work out a solution to this problem. There's a lot of potential solutions, and I would not have made the motion to override had he come to the table on it, and he would not do it. Now, does his argument about the veto have some merit? Yes, it does. He thinks we spent it out of the wrong fund. That's a colorable argument. I have another colorable argument that says the fund we spent it the way we did it was okay. That's not clear. But what is clear is that was a soluble problem, and the only reason we had a veto override was because people were not sitting down and working these things out.
So they aren't.
Yeah,
but do we know?
pick up a little
Phil,
bit
thank you. Yeah.
I want to pick up a little bit on what Chris was saying, and maybe this is a little bit stronger than I should be saying as a reporter, but I go back to Warren Hearns as governor. I can't remember a governor as unengaged in working with legislators to hammer out the details of public policy issues as Jay Nixon has been. I hear the complaints from Democrats, from Republicans. This is a governor who sits back, waits till the legislature does something, and then slams his veto or signs the bill. But the uninvolvement in the legislative process really stands out with Jay Nixon.
So I'm going to ask the 2-year-old's question, why? Does anybody know why? Can you give me a good reason? I know you all want to be careful here, but
it's a style. It's a personal style. Carnahan and Bond and Hearns were all very involved. Ashcroft less so. I think Blunt less so. I think it's a matter of Ashcroft tend to be a little more imperial. Jay tends to be a little more imperial. Bond and Carnahan were in there scrapping all the time on the structure.
Don't forget, Chris, that John Ashcroft negotiated in late night sessions with Jim Matheson over there on the Senate side of the building, the higher education tax increase that the voters rejected.
Absolutely right. And he also, with me, we sat in his office
and
arm wrestled about the durable power of attorney for health care. So Ashcroft would do it if forced, but not those other two liked it. Carnahan and Bond liked it.
Again, putting on the professor's hat for a minute, in some ways, this is what you get when you have a government of separate institutions sharing powers, right? The governor, like the president, is not a prime minister. Their job description does not necessarily say they're out there crafting legislation. They can take the route that Governor Nixon has taken and that certain American presidents have taken, standing back and trying to govern through the veto pen. That's a possibility. In some ways, it's what you hear Republicans saying they want, right? Is more separation of powers, the governor doing what the governor should do, and the legislature making the laws, the governor either signing them or vetoing them. Separation of powers, remember, is designed to facilitate less government, not more government, right? In some ways, conservatives shouldn't want a governor who's in there mixing it up on every bill that comes along and trying to cut deals with the legislature, because that is where you're going to get more government action. If you have a more distant governor who is just going to sign or veto bills, that's probably going to be a recipe for actually smaller government.
Yeah. Unfortunately, the governor's not here, but do we have any idea what his answer to that question would be as to why? Do you think it is the personal style? I mean, you think that's his answer?
Yeah,
most likely?
I think that philosophically he does not. He thinks it makes sense to let us do our work and him do his work. And personally, I think that he doesn't seem to be willing to come down to our level, if it were, kind of,
part of that, but the other thing that from my side, I think part of it's a political calculation, in that if he is not out leading on an issue, he can't be damaged on either side of it.
That's true. And the other thing is, practically speaking, some of the Republican leadership have gone out of their way to pour poison on that too. You know, there's no two ways that the bad relationship goes both ways.
I agree.
I was going to say, one sort of mental exercise we could undertake would be, would he govern differently if he had a Democratic majority in one or either house? You might actually see him much more involved then. But he's looking at large Republican majorities in both chambers, which is going to affect the way you behave.
Phill?
Kit Bond, but Marvin, Kit Bond negotiated with legislators, worked through a huge consumer protection package, a major wave of ethics legislation with an overwhelming Democratic majority in the legislature. John Ashcroft dealt with a Democratic majority in the legislature.
Yeah, Phill, I mean,
that may be a motivation for Jay Nixon, but if you look at the history of this
parties
state,
are much different now than they were then, and you don't have the overlap. You don't have conservative Democrats in the legislature. You don't have liberal Republicans in the legislature like you did in the historical examples you gave. I think that now you're looking at much more polarized parties out there, and much more difficult for a governor to find common ground with the other side, I believe.
Clearly, Bond and Ashcroft had more problems with the Republicans in the Senate than they did with the Democrats in the Senate.
Okay.
yeah, particularly for Kit Bond, whose staff was called Kitty Corps by Dick Webster and other Republicans in the Senate at the
That's
time.
right.
Well, okay, so one of the themes we're talking about here that has been coming up consistently is this idea of, symbolism versus philosophy, politics, all of that. And we're talking now about some of the problems and where everyone has set their stakes, if you will. But where would we go from here to change that? To have the discussions you're talking about, Representative Berry, and to actually work together? Is it possible? What would have to happen for that to work?
What has to happen is exactly that, conversation. I mean, being willing to sit and talk about things. The old-fashioned supper club, where you had different philosophies sitting down and you got to know the people and you talked about it and saw where they were coming from. Because all that we're talking about are problems. Do we want good education? Yes. How do we get there? A lot of people need the input. But it just comes down to relationships. I know who the governor is. I've shook his hand a few times. But there's never been a conversation. And I don't think that, Chris and I know each other, but on what level? We have to have a relationship base in order to build trust and get these things done. And I think we can get there, but it takes people from both sides willing to be engaged.
TJ is precisely correct. In the bad old days, when I was here before, we used to eat together and people play cards, and I can remember playing bridge in Republican offices over in the Senate, a lot more than they do today. Today, there's a lot more animosity and a lot less personal relationships, and it's a very big problem.
Relationships take time. Mm-hmm. And again, going back to term limits undermine the time you have and your incentive to invest time in those relationships.
Right. Phill, what about you? Do you think there's any fix here?
I wonder if the governor is thinking about a near historic number of veto overrides, that maybe he needs to have a better working relationship with the legislature. This is a guy, he's a gregarious, friendly guy. He can, for those of us who've talked with him, he's knowledgeable about these issues. He's not a left-wing liberal Democrat. This is a moderate conservative Democrat who can actually, he's got a foot on each side of the aisle in some ways. There's an opportunity for him to exert some leadership. Yeah, maybe he needs to think a little bit about what does he want to leave as a legacy as governor. He's only got a few more years left. He's got an opportunity to accomplish something. I wonder if 10 veto overrides, is he thinking about that now?
One other thing, we have about 5 minutes left on the show. It's probably definitely not enough time to talk about this, but we should try anyway, because it's another thing everyone is talking about after this this veto session last week is the role of money in the legislature. Some people are saying that this is Rex Sinquefield 0, Governor Nixon 1, because he had poured so much money. A millionaire in St. Louis area poured a lot of money into the veto override effort. Is that true? Is this going to influence the role of money in Missouri state politics, or is this just a blip on the map?
It's a blip.
I
The
agree.
money's huge and bad.
But let's talk about that for just a second. Anybody can get on the MEC website and look at what money that I've received. I've never taken a penny from Rex. I've never met the man. I've never received any money from any PAC that he controls. Why did the problem come up on 253? We have to create jobs. Okay, he is injected himself for his reasons. Great, but the problem's still the same. And the governor spent a tremendous amount of money traveling the state and got plenty of free advertising.
I would actually
Marvin?
disagree with both the representatives about on the tremendous or the huge, whatever the word was to define the amount of money in the process. In the context of an economy as large as Missouri's, the amount spent on politics is actually pretty small, and you can say that about the nation too. You see hundreds of thousands or millions or even billions of dollars at the national level being spent. Everyone thinks, boy, that's just an incredible amount of money. Well, not when you compare it to the size of our economy and sort of what's going on, how much money it takes to reach people, how much money it takes to get a message across. I'm not one of these people who wrings my hands and says there's just far too much money in politics. I would be actually amenable to an argument there may not be enough money in politics because getting people's attention and getting them to focus takes money.
Phil, I wonder your thoughts on that. Again, that analysis that this was, a win over big money.
The governor has a multi-million-dollar new airplane. He flew around the state to rally votes to sustain his veto on the tax cut bill. Rexenfeld put $2-point-something million into largely TV commercials. Maybe it leveled the playing field a little bit. I tend to agree with Marvin. Does this state stand out as the only state that has no limits on lobbyist gifts to legislators, no limit on campaign contributions? Absolutely. We're number one in that. We're the only one. But on the other hand, Rexenfeld kind of lost. He, for $2-and-something million trying to get that veto overridden, he lost.
For a first attempt at something and creating an organization, I think that he's just started in creating what he wants. And we will see. How long did it take labor to create their organizations and to develop the powerhouse that labor is? Let's put a incomplete score on Rex's structure that he's building and see what happens.
Okay.
But even at $2.7 million, that's 50 cents a person in the state. I mean, it's just
Let's
not
see
a
what
hell of a lot.
happens with those 15 Republicans who are now targeted.
Right. Well, unfortunately, we have to end the conversation there. Like I said, I knew that wouldn't be enough time. But thank you very much for joining us today for Intersection. Thanks to our guests, Democratic Representative Chris Kelly, Republican Representative T.J. Berry, MU Political Science Professor Marvin Overby, and Phill Brooks, who's been covering the state legislature since 1972. We'd like to remind those of you enjoying this as a rebroadcast that Intersection takes place live for a full hour from 2 to 3 every Monday afternoon. You can watch live streaming video of our program each Monday afternoon online at kbia.org. Alongside that video, you can submit your questions and comments and take part in an online discussion with others in the audience. You'll find an archive of all of our past programs, including the full hour of today's conversation. Intersection is broadcast from the Reynolds Journalism Institute and is a project of RJI and KBIA. Intersection is produced by Raymond Tungakar, Janet Saidi, and Reuben Stern. Travis McMillan's our technical director with production assistance from Sarah Harkins and Caleb Hoke. And Casey Morrell. Pat Akers is our audio producer. I'm Ryan Fimuelliner. Thanks for joining us today, and have a great week.